Benjen Stark rose early in the dim morning light, his breath steaming in the frigid air atop the wall. He had become so accustomed to the chill of the north that it might as well have been the warmth of a southern summer, for his hands scarcely trembled anymore when he gripped the ice-slicked stones or the cold wooden hilt of his sword. The massive structure of ice beneath him groaned softly in the pre-dawn hush, a great and ancient sentinel that had stood watch for 8 millennia. It was in that patient quiet that he often found a rare moment of peace, a fleeting sense that beyond the vast wilderness and nameless terrors of the far north, there could be a glimmer of something more than mere duty. Yet duty was what guided him. Duty was what drove him to stand upon the windswept edge of the wall, scanning the horizon and recalling all that had been lost and all that still might be lost if he and the Night's Watch faltered. He was First Ranger now, a responsibility that once seemed a distant possibility when he was a young Stark among siblings in Winterfell's halls. He had grown into it, as surely as the black wool cloak upon his back had grown ragged with years of service. Now, like the black of that cloak, his sense of commitment was deepened by the passing of seasons, made heavier and darker by what he had witnessed beyond the wall. He had seen strange tracks in the snow, villages abandoned overnight for no apparent reason, quiet pockets of utter stillness where even the wind held its breath. The wildlings were stirring more than usual, yes, but there was something else at play, something darker, like a great shadow shifting. He did not name it, for men who served long upon the wall learned to distrust rumors and talk of magical evils. But in the hush of his own mind, he admitted he was afraid. This fear was not for himself alone but for the realm he had left behind, Winterfell, King's Landing, even the far-off Dorne. When a threat rose in the north, it threatened all the realms of men. He was there at the edge, braced against the cold as he peered toward the unbroken whiteness of the desolate wilderness. A brief flicker of movement made him narrow his eyes. The crows roosting around the top of the wall took flight then, disturbed by the presence of men behind him, and Benjen turned to see a pair of black-clad rangers ascending the last of the icy steps. One was Darren, a lanky youth who had grown deft with a bow. The other was Gody, a silent older man whose background was rumored to be that of a poacher. They reached the top and dipped their heads in respect. "Benjen," said Darren, an easy grin forming on his face despite the cold. He might have tried to sound casual, but the winter wind stole the warmth from his words. "You're up before the shift change again." Benjen raised an eyebrow. If the First Ranger can't climb a few dozen flights of steps without complaining, the realm is in grave danger. That drew a brief chuckle from Darren, though Gody remained stolid and watched the horizon. The old poacher was never much for conversation, which suited Benjen well enough. Sometimes out here, with the hush of the northern wind, it felt better to keep silent. They joined him at the parapet. The world beyond the wall lay under a pale wash of moonlit dawn. Endless snowfields, jagged mountains, and sparse pine forests that spread in irregular patches across the tundra. Any one of those stands of trees might conceal a small wildling camp, or nothing at all. Winter made no distinction. Beneath the hazy sky, anything could hide. Benjen let the quiet stretch before he spoke again. "Have you heard from Ed Tollett?" Darren nodded, exhaling a curl of vapor. He returned at midnight with the rest from Eastwatch. No major sightings except a small band of free folk near the frozen shore. Seemed harmless enough, just huddled in driftwood huts. They told him the winds have been strange these last moons. Strange winds were nothing new. Make certain he sends a report to the Lord Commander. We'll go out on a fresh ranging soon. Might as well go prepared. The two men nodded in unison. Benjen turned to gaze south, where the sky glimmered faintly above the Wolf's Wood, hidden far beyond the ice. He thought of Winterfell again, of his brother Ned, now Warden of the North. He tried to picture what changes might have taken place since he'd last visited. A part of him longed to ride south at least once more, to see the old Godswood, to walk the familiar corridors of the castle where he had grown up. But the life he had chosen, no, the life that had fallen to him after certain tragedies, kept him bound to the black. He had made his peace with it as best as one could, though a sense of longing tugged at him from time to time. He turned from the parapet, Let's see if the kitchens have anything hot for a man to drink. Then we'll gather the others. We head beyond the wall in 2 days. They descended the icy steps carefully, the crows taking to the air again, circling over their heads like dark omens. Benjen's foot slipped once on a patch of treacherous ice, but he steadied himself in a heartbeat. Darren nearly lost his balance but grabbed Godey's shoulder before he could tumble forward. The clang of steel-tipped boots against slippery stone echoed downward, and soon the 3 rangers entered the tunnel at the base of the wall. The warmth of Castle Black, or what passed for warmth, greeted them with the faint smell of wood smoke. The yard was busy with the changing of the watch. Men stamping their feet against the cold, a few cursing at the stiff morning wind, others hauling barrels of supplies to be stored for the day's use. The routine never changed, not really. It was a cycle. Stand watch, train, patrol, rest, and do it all again while time ground on. No matter the king in the south, no matter the wars or the fleeting alliances, the watch stood guard. That was the vow. Benjen parted ways with Darren and Godey by the armory, then headed toward the common hall to find a warm brew. The large double doors groaned in complaint as he pushed them open, letting in a blast of cold that made the men inside flinch. Breakfast was underway. A few rangers and stewards hunched over bowls of porridge with a side of stale bread, their faces drawn. Here and there, a few men perked up as he entered. Being a Stark name, he had a certain presence even in the Black Brotherhood, though he tried not to let it shape their interactions. He simply nodded and fetched himself a small wooden bowl, ladling hot broth from a cauldron. Then he wrapped his hands around it, savoring its meager heat, and glanced about the long table. He saw Ed Tollett, nicknamed Dolorous Ed, at the far end, quietly poking at his food. The man looked perpetually glum but loyal all the same. Benjen took a seat nearby and waited until Ed lifted his eyes from the half-eaten meal. "You've returned from East Watch," Benjen said, his voice low to avoid drawing too much attention. "Did you see anything that might concern me?" Ed shook his head. "Fewer wildlings than usual, First Ranger. The ones we found were half-starved. They had little interest in raiding or crossing the wall. Mostly they complained about ghost stories, claimed they heard the howling of dead things in the night. I can't say I blame them for being spooked. This place is frightening enough when the wind kicks up." Benjen let those words settle. Every year, the rumors grew darker among the wildlings. Talk of undead creatures, white shadows, or pale spiders the size of hounds. The watch generally chalked it up to superstition. Still, something was stirring beyond the wall. If even the wildlings felt it, that gave weight to the rumors. "We'll be going out on a ranging soon," Benjen said after a moment. "I want you to rest up. You'll come with me along with Darren, Godey, and a few others. I'm looking for something. Someone, perhaps." "Someone?" Ed asked, brow furrowing. Benjen hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's been talk of a new gathering of free folk north of the Milkwater. Something about a mysterious leader who speaks in hushed tones of alliances in the south. Wild rumor. Maybe. Wildlings love to invent tales. But I need to see for myself." Ed nodded gloomily. "I can't say I'm much looking forward to the cold, but a vow is a vow." They spoke a little longer, mostly idle talk, then parted ways. Benjen finished his broth quickly. He felt a stir of unease that had not quite settled. As he rose from the table, he steeled himself with a simple truth. One did not learn anything by cowering behind walls. Whatever the rumored gatherings in the north, he would confront them. The watch needed to know what they faced. For the next day and a half, he and his chosen men prepared. They gathered supplies: dried meats, hard bread, skins of water and ale, furs, torches, fresh arrow fletchings. Horses would be of little use beyond certain points where the terrain grew treacherous, so they made sure to prepare enough for a journey on foot. Benjen wrote a brief note for Lord Commander Georg Mormont, detailing the route they would likely take and the purpose of the mission. But to himself, he kept his deeper suspicions. Targaryens had been a whisper in the south for years now, Viserys and Daenerys rumored to be in exile across the Narrow Sea, and the remains of loyalists scattered throughout the Seven Kingdoms. It hardly seemed likely that a Targaryen loyalist plot could fester among the wildlings beyond the wall. Yet he had heard strange murmurs from wildling captives, from whispers carried by the merchants who traded in secret. Someone was calling themselves a prince of the true blood, or so it was said. Benjen found it hard to credit such claims, but he had also grown up hearing tales of Targaryen pretenders during the Blackfire rebellions. It was not impossible, and if it was true, if there was some threat to King Robert's reign brewing in the uncharted north, it could plunge the realm into chaos once again. No matter how Benjen personally felt about Robert Baratheon or the Targaryens, the Night's Watch had sworn to protect the realm. That included preventing Targaryen loyalists from forging an army of wildlings, if that was indeed what they sought. 2 days later, at dawn, the ranging party set out. The gate through the wall yawned open before them, a dark mouth in the ice, and the sunlight glittered off the frozen walls. Benjen led the way, wearing a heavy cloak of black fur, with his sword at his hip and a shortbow slung across his back. Ed Tollett followed on his left, while Darren and Gody flanked the rear with 3 other rangers, Tarl, Morton, and a young steward named Helmer who had volunteered to learn more about the life beyond the wall. Their breaths made small clouds in the frigid air as they passed through the long, torchlit tunnel, the walls of which shimmered like dark, wet glass. When they emerged on the other side, the air seemed colder still, and the morning sky stretched out, a wan light over the snowy expanse. They marched north along the established trails first, winding among the scraggly pines that dotted the foothills near the wall. The snow crunched beneath their boots, sometimes up to their knees. Ravens croaked overhead. If there was any constant companion beyond the wall, it was the ever-watchful raven. When the day grew older, they set a modest camp in the lee of a rocky outcrop. The nights were long here, and the cold grew vicious after sundown. Benjen spent that first night standing watch himself, letting the others rest. The darkness brought out shapes in the corner of the eye, twisting silhouettes of branches, flickers of movement that were nothing more than the wind. At some point, he found himself remembering a time when he was a boy, venturing out beyond Winterfell's walls to climb trees with Ned and their older brother, Brandon. Brandon was gone now, as was Lyanna. Ned was in the south, serving Robert Baratheon as Hand of the King. And Benjen was here, alone in the dark. A swirl of old grief settled around him, but he pushed it aside. He had chosen a path, or a path had chosen him. There was no point in regret. They woke the next morning to a faint dusting of new snow. The air smelled sharper than usual, a sign perhaps of an approaching storm. Nonetheless, they continued northward. The going was slow but familiar. They passed the carcass of a deer half buried in a drift, likely taken down by a wolf pack. Occasionally, Darren would loose an arrow at a hare or a fox, hoping to add fresh meat to their rations. Their travels were quiet until they came upon the first sign of people. At midday on the 4th day, they spotted smoke. A slender column rose above a sparse stand of pine, faint but distinct against the bleached sky. Benjen signaled for silence, and the men drew their bows as they approached. The old ranger had learned the hard way that one could never be too cautious beyond the wall. Yet what they found was not a threat, only a small band of wildlings, huddled around a hastily built fire near a half-frozen stream. They had furs and crude spears, and their faces were gaunt with hunger. The wildlings saw the rangers and leapt to their feet, glaring with a mix of fear and defiance. Benjen raised a hand in peace. "We mean you no harm. We only want to ask you some questions." The wildlings, numbering 5 or 6, glanced at one another. One man, older with a scraggly beard, spat. "Black brothers have only questions, never help. Leave us be." Benjen kept his voice calm. "I can give you some food. If you have any news to share, it might be worth your while." At that, the wildlings hesitated. One of the women shifted uneasily. Her cheeks were sunken, and her eyes were tired. After a moment, she nudged the older man aside, stepping forward. She looked Benjen up and down, then cast a wary glance at the rangers behind him. "We've seen men moving north," she said at last. "Not free folk, not your men either, Southrons, I think. Their armor was too fine." Some wore a dragon sigil, they said. Others had no sigil at all, just black leathers and red cloaks. We wanted no part of them, so we kept away. That's all I know. Benjen felt a prickle of unease. A dragon sigil. It could be a wildling misinterpretation, perhaps a stylized beast or a banner from some lesser house. But the word dragon was enough to stir an old fear. When was this? The woman shrugged. A month ago. Maybe more. I lose track out here. She reached out a hand. You said you'd offer food? Ed handed her a pouch of dried meat and some stale biscuits. She took them quickly, not meeting his eyes, as though ashamed to accept charity from the Black brothers. The older man looked ready to protest, but the woman handed him a portion and the tension eased. Benjen nodded. If you see more of them, keep your distance. We cannot promise help, but the area ahead is dangerous. A storm is coming, and men who do not belong here may do anything to survive. The wildlings grunted. One of the men, the tallest, spoke up then. There's talk that they're searching for something or someone. We heard rumors of gold changing hands. A secret mission, some say. I don't know. Doesn't matter to us. We keep to ourselves. Not that it does us any good. His bitterness was clear, though it lacked the usual raw hatred wildlings directed at the watch. Hunger softened pride. Thank you, Benjen said. Stay safe. They parted ways. Benjen's rangers pressed north, more on guard than before, each turning the possibility of Targaryen banners in their minds. They murmured among themselves as they marched, breath steaming. Darren, who was usually glib, looked subdued. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. You think they're really Targaryens? Benjen glanced back at him. Hard to say. If they are, we have bigger problems than we thought. Godi remained silent, but his weathered face showed a flicker of concern. He never wasted words, even less so on speculation. Ed frowned at the sky as if he might find answers there. They could be sellswords using a sigil. Some men will use any banner if it scares others enough. Benjen nodded. True. Let's not jump to conclusions. We'll find out more when we reach the rivers. They continued their journey, following the winding path along a ridge that overlooked a broad valley. By nightfall, they made camp in a small hollow surrounded by evergreen shrubs. The wind whistled through the branches in mournful tones, and the men huddled close to the fire, keenly aware of the gloom pressing in. Usually, they spoke of trivial things, memories of better days, jokes about the day's misfortunes. Tonight, though, the conversation circled around the possibility of Targaryens alive and well beyond the wall. Morton, a stout ranger with a scar across his cheek, muttered, Robert Baratheon ended the dragon line, didn't he? Save for the girl and the boy rumored to be in Essos. Why would any Targaryens be here? Tarl, a wiry man who had served for nearly a decade, shrugged. Could be loyalists flying the banner, maybe leftover supporters from the rebellion, or a new pretender trying to rouse the free folk against the crown. Waste of their time, if you ask me, Ed said glumly. You'd think they'd pick somewhere warmer if they wanted to start a rebellion. Darren almost laughed, but the sound came out choked. Benjen stared into the flames, deep in thought. It was not impossible for exiled Targaryen loyalists to try to rally wildlings. Mance Rayder had once roused the free folk, after all, though for different reasons. If someone offered the wildlings a cause, a promise to shatter the wall or march south to claim new lands, that might indeed tempt some to follow. The Targaryen name still held power in the minds of many, and the north was vast enough to hide any number of secrets. Their campfire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night air. Benjen told them all to get some rest. For tomorrow they'd continue toward the Milkwater. He took the first watch again, restless and uneasy. The night pressed on, filled with the faint hoots of owls and the distant howling of wolves. He gazed north, trying to see beyond the darkness. What he saw was only the reflection of the fire in the endless white expanse. But in his mind's eye, he saw a swirl of possibilities. A Targaryen banner fluttering in the cold wind, an army of wildlings mustering beneath a red dragon, King Robert's furious reaction if word reached King's Landing. And then he saw Ned's face, stoic and resolute as it had ever been. Ned would want to know the truth. Benjen decided he had to find that truth, and soon. They rose early, ate a cold breakfast, and pressed on. As they traveled deeper into the wild, the terrain shifted from gentle slopes to sharper ridges. The pines grew denser in pockets, and the wind took on a harsher bite. On the 7th day of their ranging, they encountered fresh tracks, a dozen men or more, judging by the footprints. The tracks were not made by wildling moccasins, but rather by heavier boots. Some prints suggested spurs. They followed them as best they could, though the wind and snowfall threatened to cover them. Near midday, they spotted another thin trail of smoke. Benjen signaled for the party to advance quietly. They hid their horses among a stand of pine and proceeded on foot, bows at the ready. The closer they got, the more signs they saw. Footprints, broken branches, a half-eaten rabbit discarded at a makeshift campsite. At length, they came upon a small clearing. There, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, was a group of men. Their cloaks were dark, their armor mostly leather and steel. Some had a symbol stitched on the shoulder, a 3-headed dragon in red thread. Benjen drew in a sharp breath. One of the men stood guard, a hood over his head. Another knelt by a fire, warming his hands. A third was rummaging through a saddlebag. The men muttered among themselves, their voices low. Benjen gestured for his rangers to spread out. He had no intention of letting these strangers slip away, but he wanted to observe first. "Once we cross the then territory, we'll meet up with him," one man was saying. "If the bastard's even there," said another. "For all we know, he's run back south." "He has the gold," the first hissed. "You saw the coin. It's true Valyrian steel he carries, or so they say. A sword from the old days. If he's a true Targaryen, it'd make sense." A scoffing snort. "Prince of Ashes, I heard. No more a Targaryen than I am. But if he's paying..." Benjen felt a chill that had little to do with the icy wind. It was indeed a Targaryen sigil, and these men spoke of meeting another figure who claimed to be of Targaryen blood. Could it be some pretender who planned to gather a force beyond the wall? The rangers exchanged glances. They could attempt to take these men prisoner, though the watchers outnumbered them only slightly. Surprise was on their side. Benjen decided quickly. He signaled Ed and Tarl to circle around while Darren and Godi would come from the opposite side. They moved noiselessly among the pines, the snow absorbing the sound of their footfalls. When they were in position, Benjen emerged into the clearing, bow in hand. "Halt," he said, his voice cool. "You stand before the Night's Watch in the lands beyond the wall. I'd know your purpose." The men startled. 2 leapt to their feet, hands going for weapons. One man tried to draw his sword, but Darren's arrow found his chest before he could fully unsheath it. He toppled into the snow with a strangled cry. The others froze, startled by the silent watchers emerging around them, bows drawn. "Seven hells!" shouted the man who had been rummaging through a saddlebag. He raised his hands. "We've no quarrel with you, Crow. Let's talk." Benjen advanced slowly. "You wear the banner of the dragon. That's a dangerous thing to wear these days." The man's eyes darted to the fallen comrade, panic flaring. "We didn't come here to fight the Watch. We're on our own errand." "And that errand is?" Benjen prompted, though he already suspected the answer. The man looked around, as if seeking some way out. He saw only the ranger's arrows trained on him. "We serve a patron. That's all you need to know." Benjen's voice hardened. "I think I need to know more than that." He gestured with his bow. "Throw down your weapons. Step forward slowly." The man glowered, but he saw no alternative. He and his companion carefully tossed their blades to the ground. The guard near the overhang followed suit. The one kneeling by the fire swore under his breath as he rose, hands in the air. Benjen had Tarl collect the discarded steel. "We were told to meet with the free folk," the spokesman admitted at last, "to see if they'd join our cause. Our patron is someone who's traveled far to reclaim what's his." "Reclaim the Iron Throne?" Benjen asked quietly. The man shrugged as if not entirely sure. He says he's rightful heir, that the usurper has no claim. We're just sellswords paid in gold dragons. Strange coin, too, might be from Essos. He told us to come here, gather a following. We heard rumors of a king beyond the wall once, so we thought maybe these wildlings might rally again. They hate the southern kings, don't they? Benjen felt a knot tighten in his stomach. How large a force does your patron have? We're not the only band. We were told others are searching in different directions. Once we find Mance Raider or someone with enough standing among the wildlings, we're to say that the Targaryen king will break the wall. He'll let them spill into the north if they support him with numbers. The man paused, and a bitter smile crossed his face. Empty talk, if you ask me, but the gold is real enough. Where is this patron? Benjen demanded. The man hesitated, glancing at his fellows as if unsure what to reveal. He bit his lip. We were to rendezvous at Craster's Keep if we didn't find a suitable warband, then move further north, near the Milkwater. There's talk of a hidden camp in the Frostfangs. That's all I know. Benjen believed that was likely the truth of it, at least as far as these men knew. He turned to Ed. Bind them. We'll decide what to do with them come morning. The captured sellswords did not resist. They seemed cowed by the Rangers' superior positioning. Ed, Tarl, and Morton soon had them stripped of weapons and bound with rope around their wrists. A brief search of their packs revealed letters with a distinct seal, a dragon's head pressed into red wax. The letters were short instructions referencing a young dragon and a meeting with free folk. One letter bore a more elaborate message. Be prepared for the forging of a new realm. The rightful blood will reclaim the seat of fire and blood. It was signed with a flourish that looked like an A, though the name was not entirely legible. Benjen guessed it might be an alias, or the initial of someone bold enough to challenge the might of the Iron Throne. Benjen pocketed the letters, his heart heavy with the realization that this was no idle rumor. Some conspirator with Targaryen pretensions was gathering force beyond the wall. Whether it was actually a Targaryen or a pretender did not matter much. The damage could be profound if they united the wildlings. If a large enough host were to gather, the Night's Watch might not be able to hold them. King Beyond the Wall Mance Raider had proven how dangerous that possibility was, and if an outsider brought gold and promises, many free folk might be swayed. That night, they camped in the same clearing, setting double watches with the bound sellswords off to one side under guard. Snow fell lightly, drifting onto the branches overhead. The rangers spoke in low voices, their words carrying the tension of this new revelation. Even Godi, who rarely uttered more than a grunt, murmured something about dragons in the snow, shaking his head at the madness of it all. Benjen stayed awake long after the others, reading and rereading the letters. The references were vague, but the repeated mention of fire and blood, and the presence of a three-headed dragon on these men's clothing made it obvious that the conspirators wanted the Targaryen name to inspire fear and awe. If Robert Baratheon heard of this, he would send riders, ravens, possibly an entire force to crush such a rebellion. But the wildness beyond the wall might protect these plotters longer than they expected. The question was, should Benjen and his rangers attempt to hunt down the so-called Targaryen themselves? Or should they hurry back to Castle Black to warn the Lord Commander and, by extension, the rest of the realm? At last, he decided they needed more information before they returned. If they could find this pretender's camp near the Milkwater or glean details of the plan, they could offer Lord Commander Mormont a clearer report. So he resolved they would journey deeper, though the risk loomed large. The wildlings themselves might be hostile, and now these sellswords were scattered who knew where. But the Watch had endured worse dangers, and the security of the realm might hinge on learning the truth. With that decided, Benjen slipped into a troubled sleep. His dreams were turbulent, filled with swirling snow, the roar of distant flames, and the fleeting impression of a dragon shadow flying overhead. When he woke, the morning light was pale and wan. The rest of the camp roused slowly, the sellswords cold and shivering against the ropes that bound them. The rangers questioned them further. Most insisted they knew little beyond what they had already confessed. Two of them seemed genuinely clueless. One, the guard with the hood, had apparently been hired only a fortnight prior for a handful of gold. The only additional clue was a mention that their patron or one of his main agents had silver-white hair. Could be Targaryen hair, or just some Essosi trait, one man muttered. Regardless, it suggested that these conspirators were trying to evoke the Targaryen mystique in every detail. Benjen was torn between taking these prisoners back to the wall or bringing them along. In the end, he decided to keep them with the party. If he let them go, they might try to rejoin the conspirators. If he sent a few rangers to escort them back, he'd lose manpower on the hunt. Still, it would be difficult traveling with prisoners in tow. He ordered that the sellswords remain bound, with Tarl and Morton tasked to watch them closely. The group pressed on. The weather worsened that afternoon, a stiff wind blowing flurries in their faces. They trudged over uneven ground, occasionally flanking steep slopes to avoid avalanche risk. Twice they thought they glimpsed movement on distant ridges, but it was only rock and snow. As daylight waned, they descended into a wide valley leading toward the Milkwater, which was still a day or two away by foot. The gloom of dusk settled heavily, and an eerie hush pervaded the air. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if anticipating something. That night they found shelter in a shallow cave. The sellswords were placed near the entrance, where Tarl and Morton could keep an eye on them easily. Darren, Gody, and Ed arranged a fire. Benjen helped gather wood from nearby shrubs, aware that each passing hour brought them closer to the rumored meeting place, and perhaps to confrontation with a man claiming Targaryen blood. As they huddled around the crackling flames, Benjen noticed one of the sellswords, a younger man with a healing scar on his forehead, shivering uncontrollably. The man gazed at the rangers with pleading eyes. "We'll freeze to death," he muttered. "At least let us near the fire." Benjen studied him. The vow to protect the realm did not require cruelty, but neither could they let themselves be deceived. Yet something in the man's voice suggested genuine fear. With a small nod, Benjen gestured for Tarl to move them a bit closer. He kept them bound, though, and posted watch with a stern glare. The sellswords edged nearer, grateful for even a fraction more warmth. Silence fell, broken by the soft crackle of burning wood. When Benjen woke the next morning, he found the sky overcast, the air gray and bitter. Ice clung to the men's cloaks. They packed up camp quickly, the sense of urgency growing. The sellswords, stiff-limbed from the cold, moved slowly. Morton prodded them forward with curt commands. They followed the valley northward, eventually coming upon a wide swath of frozen water, some offshoot of the Milkwater, perhaps. They trekked along its bank until, in the late afternoon, they spotted footprints again, heading toward a cluster of tall pines. Benjen signaled for caution. The trees blocked their view. Leaving Tarl and Morton with the prisoners, he and the rest advanced quietly to scout. Inside the pine grove, they found tracks of multiple parties, all converging from different directions. The footprints were fresh. Broken twigs suggested recent passage. Voices echoed faintly somewhere ahead, enough that Benjen could not distinguish words, but definitely men, or possibly wildlings. He crept forward, Ed and Darren at his side. They paused behind a large pine, peering through the branches. In a small clearing within the grove, a group of about 20 men, some in black leathers with that same red dragon sigil, others dressed like free folk, stood in tense conversation. Near the center stood a tall figure cloaked in thick white fur. His hair was indeed silver white, hanging below his shoulders, and he wielded a slender sword whose pommel glinted with something that could have been rubies. Benjen's heart pounded. Could this be the rumored Targaryen or his agent? He was taller than most Targaryens Benjen had known of. Prince Rhaegar had been lithe, but not quite as tall as this man seemed. The man's face was partially obscured by the fur collar, but his posture was regal, commanding. A wildling with braided hair argued vehemently. "You want us to march on the wall with you? That's madness. The crows will burn us with arrows before we ever cross." The silver-haired man replied in a voice too low for Benjen to catch every word, but it sounded firm, almost melodic. "Shattered, southern armies, fire, blood. Promises kept." Benjen strained to hear. He caught fragments. Something about forging an alliance, something about gold, and a repeated vow to remember our words. The Targaryen house words were fire and blood, and the half-heard pledge definitely seemed to revolve around them. A second wildling, heavily scarred, stepped forward. "Why should we believe your promises? Where's the proof you are who you say?" The silver-haired man stepped closer to the wildling, letting the fur cloak fall back enough to reveal a tunic embroidered with the three-headed dragon. He lifted the sword. Even from a distance, Benjen noted a distinctive rippled pattern along the blade. It might indeed be Valyrian steel. The man spoke in a louder tone now, and Benjen caught a phrase. "I carry the blood of the dragon. Rhaegar was my father's rightful claim." The wildlings murmured, uncertain. Some of them looked impressed by the sword alone. Valyrian steel was rare. Benjen exchanged a sharp glance with Ed and Darren. If this was truly a son of Rhaegar Targaryen, it contradicted everything the realm believed. Prince Rhaegar's children were murdered in the sack of King's Landing, though rumors had swirled for years that one child might have survived, replaced by a common babe. But those had mostly been dismissed or overshadowed by the known exiles Viserys and Daenerys. This was something else entirely, an echo from the grave of the Dragon Prince. If it was real, one of the black-clad sellswords stepped toward the silver-haired man, addressing him reverently as "my prince." That alone sent a shiver through Benjen. Another sellsword pointed to the wildlings. "They either join or we make them join." The wildling with braided hair bared his teeth in a mocking grin. "You think we're sheep to be herded? We'll join if the prize is worth it. The free folk have their own king. We'll see what Mance says about this prince." The silver-haired man's voice dropped again, but there was a cold edge to it. He seemed to speak of something that would guarantee the wildlings' loyalty, perhaps a plan to break open the wall or to show them a path through. Benjen's blood ran cold at the thought. Any major gap in the wall would endanger all the northern lands. He had to act. He signaled Ed and Darren to fall back. They retreated silently, rejoining Tarl and Morton. Benjen quickly explained what they had seen. The Rangers' faces grew grim. Darren clenched his jaw. Ed murmured a quiet curse. Tarl spat at the ground, while Morton simply set his mouth in a tight line. The prisoners overheard enough to sense the gravity of the situation. The younger sellsword with the forehead scar parted his lips, looking ready to speak, but said nothing in the end. Benjen considered their options. They were outnumbered 2-1, and more wildlings might be nearby. Launching an attack was suicide. Their best chance was to stay hidden, glean what information they could, then slip away and return to Castle Black to raise the alarm. The entire realm might soon face a threat it believed long extinguished. A Targaryen claiming to be Rhaegar's heir, forging alliances with wildlings. This was no trifling matter. With that in mind, Benjen decided they would watch a while longer, waiting to see if the group departed. If they separated, the Rangers might capture a straggler for interrogation. If they set camp, the Rangers could slip away under cover of darkness. Either way, speed was essential. The party hid themselves among the trees, the sellsword prisoners forced to lie flat in the snow, guarded by Tarl. They passed an hour in taut stillness, listening to the voices in the clearing. Eventually, the conversation died down. The silver-haired man motioned to his sellswords, and they moved deeper into the grove. The wildlings melted away in the opposite direction, presumably to speak with their chieftains or with Mance Rayder himself. The prince seemed to have a small retinue of about 8 or 9 armed men who stayed close. Benjen and his rangers crept after them, attempting to remain unseen. Each step was carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or crunching too loudly in the crusted snow. They trailed the Targaryen pretender for nearly half an hour, weaving among the pines until they reached a small encampment near a frozen waterfall. Torches glowed in the gloom. A handful of tents had been erected, made of thick hides. A horse stamped nervously at the edge of the camp. The silver-haired man disappeared inside the largest tent, flanked by 2 guards. The rest spread out, tending to the horses or setting up bedrolls. Benjen counted perhaps 12 men altogether, well armed. The Rangers crouched behind a fallen log at the perimeter of the campsite. Nightfall was near, and the temperature plummeted. Ed squinted at the flickering torches, whispering, "If we get any closer, they'll spot us. We won't be able to take them all." Benjen nodded. A direct assault would be futile. They had surprise, but not nearly enough men to overcome a dozen skilled sellswords and a rumored Targaryen wielding Valyrian steel. "We wait until they settle in, then we slip away," he whispered. "We have enough proof. The letters, the testimony. This is bigger than us." They hunkered down, waiting with bated breath as the men in the camp performed their nightly routines. An hour passed, then two. Darkness enveloped the forest. The moon climbed slowly overhead, casting pale light through the canopy. Snow drifted silently. With the camp mostly quiet, Benjen gave the signal. They carefully retreated, stepping backward into the darkness. And then a twig snapped under Darren's foot. It was faint, but in the hush of the forest, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Instantly, a sentry near the tents turned, eyes sweeping the tree line. "Who goes there?" he barked, stepping forward with a torch. Benjen dropped to one knee, beckoning the others down. But the sentry advanced, suspicion etched across his face. He held the torch high, the firelight dancing off the trunk of the pines. Another man joined him, sword drawn. "I heard something," the first hissed. Benjen could feel his heart hammering. They were too close. If discovered, they'd have to fight or flee. He wondered if he could loose an arrow quickly enough to silence them. But that would only bring the rest. Surviving such a skirmish seemed unlikely, especially with the prisoners in tow. Just then, a breeze stirred a branch overhead. Snow cascaded down onto the sentry's torch, dousing it in a hiss of steam and ice. The forest plunged into near darkness. The sentry cursed, fumbling to relight his torch. His companion stepped forward uncertainly, squinting into the blackness. Benjen seized the moment to signal retreat, slipping deeper into the woods. The rangers moved swiftly but carefully, their black cloaks blending with the shadows. The sellsword prisoners, forced to shuffle awkwardly, threatened to slow them down. Tarl hissed at them to stay quiet under pain of death. They managed to circle around the camp, the confusion of the extinguished torch buying them precious minutes. Within a short while, they were out of sight. Benjen kept them moving at a brisk pace, ignoring the protest of exhausted limbs. The night was cold, but adrenaline coursed through their veins. If those men found any trace of them, footprints or broken branches, the pursuit would be immediate. Better to keep going until they were far beyond earshot. They did not stop until the moon hung high above them, and their breath came in ragged bursts. They finally halted near a cluster of boulders. Darren leaned against one, gasping. "That was close," he managed between breaths. Benjen nodded gravely. "We have our proof. We head south at first light." Ed asked the question on everyone's mind. "What if they come after us tonight?" Benjen glanced at the sky, where clouds drifted to hide the moon. "They might, but the storm is coming. That'll slow them if they try. We'll keep watch in shifts. At dawn, we move." None disagreed. The next hours were tense but uneventful. A light snow began to fall, covering their tracks. That might be a small blessing if the conspirators attempted to track them. By the time the eastern horizon began to pale, the wind had begun to howl. It would be a rough journey back to the wall. They set out at first light. The sellsword prisoners trudged grimly, heads bowed. Whatever faint hope they had of being rescued by their comrades seemed lost now. In truth, Benjen did not relish dragging them along, but he could not risk letting them go. They might lead the prince straight to the watch if released. Besides, they were living proof of the conspiracy. The next day and a half were a miserable slog through wind-blown snow. Progress was slow. Despite the desire to hurry, they had to pick their path carefully, lest they lose a horse or a man in a concealed pit or a sudden drop. The storm worsened, stinging snow lashing their faces. Still, they pushed on, urged by a sense of urgency as well as the knowledge that the alternative, stopping in this wilderness, would expose them to pursuit or worse. Around midday on the second day of retreat, they spotted a group of figures on a ridge behind them. Benjen cursed under his breath. Through swirling snow, it was hard to make out any insignia, but the silhouettes suggested perhaps 5 or 6 men on horseback. A larger force might be near. The rangers hurried their pace, slipping into a patch of forest to break line of sight. Whoever followed them had the advantage of not lugging prisoners. The chase was on. Benjen led his men on a zigzagging route, hoping to lose the pursuers in the storm. The howling wind could mask their movement, but it also made travel miserable. The freezing temperatures turned breath to ice on their beards and eyelashes. The horses were close to exhaustion. By dusk, they had not seen the pursuers again, but the tension remained. They sheltered in the partial ruins of an old wildling fort, a ring of tumbled stones that offered meager protection from the wind. There, Benjen and Ed used the last of their dry kindling to start a small fire. Tarl and Morton stood guard while Darren scouted the perimeter. Gody examined the horses. The captured sellswords huddled together for warmth, shivering under their threadbare cloaks. Benjen did not sleep. He stood watch, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Flurries of snow whirled in the gusts, turning even nearby shapes into vague shadows. The night felt endless. Each moment, he expected to hear the clash of steel or a shout from the trees. But none came. When dawn arrived, the storm had lessened, though the wind still blew. The rangers set out again, hearts heavy but determined. The wall was still several days away. They had to survive or all their knowledge would be for naught. Midway through that day, just as they skirted the edge of a frozen marsh, Gody let out a warning cry. Their pursuers had reappeared, racing along a ridge to the east, perhaps 200 yards away. One rider carried a spear that glinted in a shaft of pale sunlight. Another wore a cloak that seemed suspiciously white, though the distance made it hard to be certain if it was the silver-haired man or another. Benjen and the rangers broke into a run, urging the horses onward. The snow was deeper than before, slowing them. They heard shouts in the wind, the pounding of hooves. An arrow whistled past and embedded itself in a tree trunk. They spurred their mounts, though the horses struggled in the drifts. Tarl twisted in the saddle to loose a return shot from his bow, but it fell short. Another arrow from their pursuers hissed overhead, narrowly missing Ed. A chase began, each side laboring through the treacherous terrain. The sellsword prisoners half-dragged behind on foot, roped to a horse. At one point, Darren dismounted to help push a stumbling horse free of a small ravine. A second arrow lodged in a nearby stump. Finally, Benjen spotted the outline of a familiar ridge, a landmark he recognized from previous rangings. If they could crest it, they might descend into a winding valley that led toward a safer route to the wall. He shouted for the men to follow him, leaning low over his horse's mane. The horse snorted, plumes of steam bursting from its nostrils, and strained forward. They reached the ridge just as the pursuers crested a parallel slope. Benjen glanced over. He saw half a dozen riders. One wore a black cloak with the red dragon sigil. Another had that white fur and silver hair, though from this distance it was hard to see clearly. A wave of dread coursed through Benjen. If that was indeed the pretender leading the hunt, their situation was dire. "Faster!" he called. His breath stung in his chest. They plunged down the far side of the ridge, the horses slipping and sliding on icy rocks. Ed and Tarl fired a few arrows back, but the swirling snow made aim difficult. The rangers could only hope to stay ahead. Their best weapon now was the punishing terrain. If they could reach the thicker forest in the valley, they might find a place to hide or double back. Within minutes, they were among tall pines and frozen streams. The pursuers fired sporadic arrows, but the density of the trees offered some cover. Benjen spotted a narrow gap between two steep hillsides, an old streambed that led back southwest. He veered the group that way, thinking they could lose the riders among the boulders. Behind them, the shouts grew more distant, muffled by the canopy. Perhaps the silver-haired pretender had realized the chase was too risky, or else the horses balked at the rough ground. Eventually, the rangers heard nothing but the wind through the pines. Benjen halted the group to catch their breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. Silence. Slowly, hearts pounding, they made their way through the old streambed. Took hours and the day wore on. By nightfall, they had put a great distance between themselves and the conspirators, so they hoped. Exhaustion weighed on them, and the captured sellswords looked half dead from fatigue and cold. They continued south the next day, forging onward with renewed determination. The terrain grew slightly more familiar. On the evening of the second day, they spotted the distant shape of the wall, a colossal line of blue-white ice stretching across the horizon. Relief flooded them. By midday on the following day, they reached the black maw of the gate. Rangers on duty shouted in surprise, quickly opening the passage. Castle Black greeted them with the smell of smoke and cooking fires. Men gathered in the courtyard as Benjen and the others stumbled in, weary and frostbitten. Word spread fast that the first ranger had returned from a perilous mission. Lord Commander Mormont descended the steps of the common hall, his gruff voice echoing across the yard as he demanded to know what had happened. Benjen spoke in fragments, ordering the sellsword prisoners be taken into custody. He handed over the letters bearing the dragon seal. Jeor Mormont read them with a stormy expression. "Targaryens beyond the wall?" he growled. "Madness." Benjen shook his head. "We saw it with our own eyes, Lord Commander. A silver-haired man, claiming Rhaegar Targaryen's blood. He's gathering wildlings or trying to. If they unite, it will be trouble for the realm. Possibly more trouble than King Robert can handle without sending an army north." The Lord Commander's eyes narrowed. "We'll have to send word to Winterfell and beyond, and we'll need to question these men thoroughly. 7 hells. We have enough to worry about with wildlings and rumors of worse things stirring in the far north. Now this." Benjen understood his frustration. The Night's Watch was already stretched thin. Winter was coming, or so the Starks always reminded the realm. And now, a potential Targaryen pretender threatened to tear open the north. "We'll do our duty, my lord," Benjen said quietly. "No matter the cost." Mormont nodded, exhaling a heavy breath. "Aye, our vows remain. We'll see to this." He clapped Benjen on the shoulder. "You did well to come back alive, Stark." Benjen bowed his head briefly. "I can only hope it's in time." And so it began. The sellsword prisoners were taken to the ice cells beneath the wall for questioning. Raven messages were dispatched to Winterfell, perhaps to King's Landing as well. The men of the Night's Watch spoke in hushed tones about dragons in the north, about a secret claimant to the Iron Throne seeking to muster an army of wildlings. Some dismissed it as madness, others saw it as a dire threat. Benjen could only brood over the memory of that silver-haired figure standing among the pines, brandishing a Valyrian steel blade. His mind went to Ned. If word reached Ned that a possible Targaryen lurked beyond the wall, that knowledge would test the North's loyalty to King Robert, or perhaps test Robert's restraint, for the king was known to be both prideful and fierce when it came to Targaryens. Yet, above all else, Benjen could not forget the swirling sense of dread that overshadowed the politics of it. There were older, darker powers stirring in the far north. There were signs in the snow and the hush of the forest that made men shiver. The living had enough to fear from the living, kings and pretenders alike, but the wall had other enemies. Perhaps the Targaryen threat would pale in comparison to what might yet come. Benjen felt it in his bones, in the quiet times of the night, as if the wind whispered warnings of cold death. Still, duty compelled him to face whatever threat rose. Days later, as Benjen stood again atop the wall, scanning the frosty horizon, he wondered if they would all live to see the next summer, or if this new Targaryen pretender would soon force the realm into yet another bloody war. The wind howled in his ear, carrying faint echoes of laughter and screams, perhaps only illusions conjured by his tired mind. Yet he could not shake the sense that some unstoppable tide was about to break. He took in the vastness beyond the wall, endless white wilderness, and within that desolation, somewhere, a silver-haired man plotted the downfall of Robert Baratheon. The realm slept on, unaware of the looming peril. But Benjen Stark had seen it, and he stood ready, as the Night's Watch always did, to hold back the darkness. Their watch was only just beginning. And this time, it was not only the savage cold or the wild free folk they had to fear. If the word Targaryen still meant what it once did, the forging fire of conquest, then soon the entire realm might learn that the dragons, in one form or another, were not quite as dead as everyone believed.